Hi everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're painting the new Space Marine Captain from the Armageddon box set, new 11th edition set that's just been released. We'll be painting him as Blood Angels, sort of following the box art but putting our own little twists on it here and there. These are all push fit models in the Armageddon set, so they're nice and easy to build. And I've primed this model in the Army Painters matte black air primer, but any black primer will do. So the first off we're going to tackle is the red armor. There's a couple of tutorials already on the channel which has got how to do this via an airbrush. We're going to do this painting, so it's going to take a little bit longer with a brush than the airbrush. But not all of you have an airbrush, so this is how you would do it via brushwork. I'm going for my usual sort of grim dark finish on this guy. So the first step is to get a nice base red down, and for this I am using AK Black Red. The colour does exactly what it says on the tin really. It is a very dark red, maybe even darker than corn red if you were using the Warhammer range, but this is just a very dark red. If you wanted to go brighter, then you would start maybe with Mephiston red and then go up in brightness, but for myself I like this dark colour. It also enables us to leave a little bit of the black in the deepest recesses, so we haven't got to do any washes over the top. So where you can, try and leave a little bit of the black in the recesses and just paint probably 99% of the red armor in this black red, just leaving those little areas showing. In terms of brush, I'm using two different ones here. I'm using my usual Kolinsky Sable Raphael's 8404 series, either a size 0 or a size 1. Obviously these are glue-free models, they're push fit, but some of you do glue them. If you are gluing this together, I would certainly leave off the shield arm. It just makes painting this guy a lot easier. So next up is AK Deep Red, which is Mephiston Red in the Warhammer range. It's a lovely colour, very rich, very pigment heavy colour. You could also use Ionic Red as well. This is any bright red colour, and all I'm doing in now is blocking in my highlights. So it's slightly thinned down the paint, a couple of drops of water. It is in the middle of a heat wave in the UK at the moment, so the paint is drying out on the wet palette really quickly. So I'm having to constantly add water to keep the paint flowing freely. I've even got an air condition unit going, but obviously that's just drying the air out. So yeah, it's doable painting in the extreme heat, but you do have to keep your wet palette pretty wet and your paints thinner than you usually would do. If you are airbrushing as well, you would keep your airbrushing, the needle can be a little bit dry, so you need some thinner, some flow improver. But the main goal here is just to block in the highlights where you want your bright red to be. Just paint in those areas this bright red colour, leaving some of that black red in the shadows and deepest recesses. Okay, now we're gonna boost the red, and by doing that, we're gonna do a sort of base layer underneath of white. So what I'm doing here is I'm thinking about where I'd want to apply an edge highlight, but just doing that in white paint. And then what we're going to do is go over the top of that in our deep red color that we've just used to sort of increase the contrast between the base coat, the first layer, and the second layer. So all you need to do is work out where you want your highlights to be, and then do edge highlighting and blocks of color. It's slightly thinned down the paint so it flows off the brush easier, does some natural gradients when you're putting the paint here and there, and just work yourself around trying to think about where the light is hitting the model and where you would want those highlights to be. Realism is kind of out the window for me on these models. It's more, these are both going to be sort of display and tabletop miniatures, so I like the model to look good generally from most angles, so I apply highlights on those areas that I really want it to stand out. thinking about where that light reflects, as you can see there, for the top part of his sort of kneecap part, and then following that highlight all the way down as if the sun is collecting and glinting in those particular areas. Once you're happy with your white highlight, we then move back to our red. So the paint's already thinned down, and now we apply the red again over the top of the white and a little bit of the surrounding area, so that you're getting a transition from the base red to the highlighted white red. Just work yourself around. If the white is still showing through, then just add another layer on top. Where we've watered the paint down a little bit, there is a slight transparency to it. But just work yourself around and build those highlights back up, making sure to cover all of that white. Don't worry if it looks a little bit garish. A couple of layers, a few glazes here and there will help repair it or restore it to how you want it to be, and we'll cover that a little bit later, as you'll see me add in some glazes from dark to light and light to dark. So now we're going to add a true edge highlight. For that I'm using Warhammer's Cadian Flesh Tone, but I believe it's AK Brown Rose and Vallejo Brown Rose work just as well. It's a sort of desaturated pink flesh tone that we're using. I think in the War Paints Fanatic range they've also got a sort of violent vermilion or something, I think it's called. And all we're doing here is edge highlighting on those parts where we want it to be intensely bright, really catching the edges. So generally in those white areas that we've previously just overpainted, it would be on those. I don't do an all over edge highlight. I try and keep my highlight like this, minimal. This paint is watered down, probably 50-50, just so the paint flows easier off the brush and we get some nice gradient transitions. As remember the old rule that we always talk about, where you leave your brush is where the most paint will be left. So if you drag your brush towards where you want it to be brightest, you'll get a slight transition between that sort of darker highlight and then your very bright highlight that we're going for. So just take care here, where you've got these sort of straight lines where the sun is glinting off of the armor, you try and hit that in the sort of center point of your highlight. So you've got a bit of the previous layer underneath and then your center line as your highlight line. And with that, the red armour is pretty much done. All I did there was just apply a little bit of AK Intense White into the very sharpest highlight areas, so it almost shows that the light is so bright it's desaturating the colour. That is optional. I just find sometimes when we're going for these effects, these high contrasts, adding a little bit of white as the final spot highlight does a really good job of differentiating between your very dark spots and your very light spots, but very minimal. Too many highlights and nothing is highlighted, so just keep that in mind if you're going to do this step. So with that bit, the armour being done, we're now just going to move over to the gold. So a couple of colours we're going to be using. The first is a base layer, which is going to be AK Rusty Gold. So I thin this down, a little drop of water, not too much, don't want overly watery sort of gold colours. They sometimes if it's too watered down, you lose the pigmentation and the flecks that are in there. It mats it down a little bit. But all I'm doing here is anywhere I want to be gold, I'm just painting this in the rusty gold, trying to follow the box art as much as possible. But obviously you can change it up as you want to. There's quite a bit of gold on this. Sort of the top of his leg guards, bits on his sword, his shoulder pads, the aquila on the back. His sword hilt as well, and loads on his shield. So just take your time, work yourself around, and underpaint all of these with the AK Rusty Gold or any dark gold that you'd like. I'm not going to go for an overly shiny gold here. I wanted the armour to stand out and be the brightest part of the miniature. The gold I wanted to look a little bit battered and worn. So once you've base coated all of the gold, you can see there was quite a lot of gold to do. I then do a wash all over it with good old Warhammer Reichland Flesh Shade. Very simple, just wash this over all of the gold areas, making sure to concentrate it on those rivets and darkest areas. But I use a size 1 brush here and just very carefully just wash over all the gold. It does help set a differentiation between some of the gold that is quite close together to each other, so you get a natural gap in between, and it will help us when we do our highlight to get a nice bright point on our gold. And leave this 10-15 minutes to dry, but you know, in the British heat that we've got at the moment, it took about 2 minutes to dry. And then once it's dry, our first highlight is going to be with AK Old Gold, which is sort of a Retributor armor from Warhammer. Nice bright gold. And with this, I'm going to do an all over edge highlight and then just block in any areas that I want to be brighter than the others, making sure to leave some of that dark rusty gold in certain areas so that you get a nice contrast between dark and light. Just obviously on the shield there, picking out the raised areas from the sort of skull and the bones. On the Aquila on his chest, just picking out some of the feathers, picking out the spikes and stuff on this little bit on top of his head, and then the top of the leg parts. But just work yourself around, just making sure you do an edge highlight with this old gold. Then the final highlight will be with AK Natural Steel, which is a really nice bright silver, and this is just a small edge highlight and little spots of it here and there where I want the most sun to be reflecting off of the gold, so it's almost reflecting so much it's desaturating the colour. So next up are the things I wanted to be pink, which is usually the tassels, the sword hilts, and the waxes as well. For that we use a few colours. We do a base coat in AK Violet Red. We then do our initial highlight in AK Magenta, and then we do a very, very small spot highlight with AK Intense Pink. With the tassels and stuff, obviously the base coat is important to get full coverage, and then using the lighter colours just to pick out the little sort of curls on the rope and the sort of tassely parts of the bits that hang down. Just take a steady hand, so using a size 0 brush. You can, if you wish, you could do this violet red layer and then do a wash, maybe of like a Carabert crimson. I mean, you could just use an oil, but of a sort of dark reddish pink colour to get some definition between the two. But I find that the violet reds to magenta to intense pink are a good transition, especially if you've thinned your paints down a little bit. You get nice coverage and good contrast. Obviously, when I keep saying thinning the paints, it's always advisable when you do drops of it out of your pot. You know, if you do like 2 little drops of it from the pot, to always add a brush full of water into your paints anyway, just to create good consistency. Allows the paint to flow off the brush, and it adds some translucency as well to your layers underneath. And as you use each colour, you'll learn how much water you need to keep adding. I will be trying to do a video soon where I talk through how I thin my paints down on the wet palette. Obviously everyone uses them a little bit differently and they want different outcomes with different brushes and different models, but I'll try and cover it off just so it's clear. But generally always add a bit of water to thin your paints down anyway, because A, it helps them last longer, and B, it just helps them flow off the brush a bit better, and has that translucency and opacity that we're looking for to keep the layers nice and smooth and clear. Right, next up will be the leather, and for this we're going to be using AK Grim Brown, AK Deep Brown, and then back to Arcadian Flesh Tone. So the Grim Brown adds the base layer, the Deep Brown is our first highlight layer, and then the Arcadian Flesh Tone finishes it off with an edge highlight and adds some scratches and scrapes and marks onto the leather. So this is his sword scabbard, the tassels between his waist, his glove, sort of protector part on his right sword arm. There's not too much leather. You can't really get to the belt, and there is a gun holster as well at the back. But if you do the base layer of a dark brown, then the deep brown, or you could use leather brown if you wish to, instead of using deep brown, but I wanted to go for a slightly richer leather colour, and then the Arcadian Flesh Tone acts as a nice highlight colour over the top, like edge highlights, and then any areas that you want to have some damage on there. For the parchments, I do base coat of light earth from AK and then go over the top of them with deck tan. I also do a wash of Serapin sepia as well, just to get some darkness into the recesses. I find light earth and deck tan. I wanted sort of bright tassels, but not too bright. Sort of parchments. I was always imagining them in battle; they would just fly off. Can't really see a wax seal holding them on very strong. But anyway, yeah. But generally, the colours for these would be any sort of how you would paint bone, but just a little bit brighter. So you could use like Xandri Dust or use Shabty Bone if you're using the Warhammer range, and just do a wash of Serapin Sepia or even Agrax Earthshade if you wanted to. So we're making some good progress with the model. Going to move on to his face. For that we're using some Kislev flesh. You could go a lot brighter, a lot paler if you wanted to follow their sort of vampiric type skin tones. I wanted just to go for a general sort of mid-tone face colour. So yeah, Kislev flesh is good for this. It takes to washes really well, and then you can highlight it with sort of like a pallid witch flesh after you've done the washes. But just thin the paint down just so it flows off nicely, and 2 or 3 layers of this will be needed to cover the black. I always thin the when I paint the faces, I always thin the paints down a little bit more than usual, just so the paint is nice and thin, and it's multiple thin layers, because the detail on the heads is very small, and too much paint can fill those gaps, and then you've almost ruined it. So yeah, multiple thin layers when you're doing the heads of very thin paint. So my first wash will be with contrast paint, Volupus Pink. So all I do here is I take 1 dollop of the paint, then apply it to the miniature, and then in a fresh clean pot of water I flood the brush with water, and then just paint that over the top of the Volupus Pink to get a nice thin, very thin coat of this contrast paint. It doesn't matter if it's thinned too much, you can always do multiple coats of Volupus Pink. You could of course just use Rycliffe Flesh Shade, but I like doing this Volupus Pink because it adds a little bit of tension to the skin, a little bit more definition into those areas, a bit more redness. And while that's drying, we're going to do some multitasking. So we're going to do some red glowing effects. So we're going to use AK Wine Red, AK Blood Red first. So this is where you want to do any glowing. So the idea of this glowing effect is the darker the colour, the colder, the brighter the colour, the hotter. So wine red is really, really cold, and our fluorescence will be where it's really, really hot. So for this, there's a gem on his belt buckle, it's the lens on his eye, and I've added it obviously to the vents on the back of his backpack, and the eyes on the skull, just for fun. So it always starts with this wine red. So generally you cover the larger area with this wine red. So the gem, you cover all of the gem and a little bit of rim surrounding it. The skulls, you cover the eye of the skull, like the socket, and you cover the entirety of the vents. And the top 4 or 5 vents on the backpack, I'll always paint with the paint coming down towards the bottom of the backpack, so that the most paint is left in that bottom part of the vent itself. So now I move on to the blood red. And for this I paint sort of the whole part of the area now. So this is, I paint with blood red the majority of the gem and the belt buckle. I paint the whole of the lens. I paint the very central points of the skulls. At the top vents I paint the bottom 2/3 of the vents. And the other vents on the backpack, you'll see that I always think of where you want the most heat source to be coming from is where it's going to be brighter, so you push your paint down into those sections with your bright paint. So the brighter the paint and you want your effect at the bottom, you push your bright paint towards the bottom to get that effect. So to get the base of our fluorescence going, we always use white. So just add a little dot of this in the top part of the gem, a little dot in the lens, little dots at the bottom of the vents, just so when we put our fluorescence on the top, you get a nice shiny effect. So for the fluorescent paints, we're going to be using, I pierced a hole at the bottom of it with a needle, so because it wouldn't mix properly. That's Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. So you give the bottle a really good shake to hear the ball bearing rattle. If you're having trouble with it, then you might have to use a very thin needle. I have to use an old airbrush needle to get in there and unclog it. But yeah, you have to shake it really well to get the ball bearing at the bottom, mixing the paint. So I'll cover the entire area that we've just painted, including the white, with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. And then I use AK Fluorescent Orange, and I use that and only cover the previous white areas that we did. So we paint over everything with the fluorescent red, and wherever we did the white highlight, I just touch those areas with a little bit of the fluorescent orange to finish the glowing effect. Okay, back to the face. Now going to do a highlight using some flayed one flesh, and with always with faces, what we do now here is picking out the flat areas, picking out the areas like the nose, the mouth, the ears, the forehead, the wrinkles. Just picking out those areas, leaving that Kislev flesh and the wash in the deepest recesses. If you do go over, so if you're doing a bit of a highlight and it goes into the recess, don't worry, you can always add back in the wash into those areas a little bit later, which we're going to be doing anyway, just to enhance those shadow areas again. So once you've done your initial highlights, if you're not happy that the contrast isn't there, you can always add washes again later just to enhance it. So it doesn't matter if you don't get it right the first attempt, you can just keep adding highlights and darkening areas down to reach the goal that you're looking for. So we're now going to move on to his cape, and I want to have him to have a black cape, but I wanted there to be some different type of highlights on this. So highlighting black is always tricky because usually you would just go with greys, but I wanted to highlight the cloak using blues, but really dark blues. So what I'm doing is it's painted in the Army Painters matte black, and what I'm going to do now with some very thin down AK deep sea blue, dark sea blue, is I'm blocking in the highlights. So probably I'm covering a third of the areas that I want to have a highlight to them with this blue colour. Where it's thinned down almost to a glaze, as you can see where I'm moving the brush, when I'm leaving the brush is where the most paint is going to be left, which is down towards the bottom of the area. So this will give a nice highlight to the cape without adding stark highlight lines or using greys. This is just using a blue. So it's a sort of a cold look to the highlights. And then to increase the brightness of the highlight, just add in a little bit of white, so just a tip of a brush now into that blue, thin it down again just so it's nice and wet, and now we're just going to do an edge highlight and pick out any of the areas we want to be brighter. So where the ridges are really intense, so adding some highlights to those, but again doing it is glazes, so thin the paint down and then moving the paint downwards towards the bottom of the cloak so that you get a nice transition from that black at the very top to this very subtle bluish grey at the bottom. But always make sure you're doing an edge highlight with the colours, just so that you get it separates the items out from the surrounding areas. doing now is adding more and more white to the mix to enhance the edges. So I try not to do too much, just little bits here and there when I'm highlighting the cloak, just so that we get a nice effect. And with that, majority of the sort of model is done. We've got some little highlights being added here and there, just to bring back some intensity to the colours. So what I wanted to do now was sort out some of the transitions. So I use AK Tenebrous Grey, really dark colour. It's not black, but it's like a very dark purple, heavily watered down. And what I'm doing now is I'm just adding in almost glazes now to the areas where I want to just add the intensity back into the model, around the eye sockets, the chin and the mouth. I also use this where it's a glaze, where it's very thin. I would say this is almost 10 drops of water to 1 drop of paint, really thin down. I add, as you can see, I'm pushing the paint upwards there. It's a good way to see it on this scabbard, where I wasn't happy with the transition from the light brown to the dark brown. So I'm adding in these glazes now, pushing the paint downwards, down towards where I want the shadows here, and upwards when I want it into those that top area, so that you get a nice transition from the light brown into the dark areas. I also do the same for the armour, so I push paint back into the recesses using this Tenebrous Grey. You could use Nuln Oil, put some Nuln Oil in a separate pot, water it down a little bit so it's a little bit thinner, and you can use these almost as a sort of adding in shadows and darker areas to a finished model. And it's always sometimes easier to do this when the model is finished, because you can see your bright points and your dark points. You can see where you've not, the transitions are a bit out, where you've been painting the model and it's gone a different way than you thought, so you need to add a shadow back here and there. And also having shadows next to really bright points enhances that brightness. You get really good shadows next to bright areas, and really good bright areas next to shadows. As James Wapple, the guy that does the miniatures in oil, says, without darkness there can be no light, and it's true. If everything was highlighted, there'd be no highlight, and if nothing was highlighted, everything would be dark. So it's a really good thing to do. Try and pick out any rivets to sort of the surrounding area, but this is just your idea now to go around, clean up the model, add in your transitions, sort of separate them out a little bit by adding in some of this Tenebrous Grey as a wash. And with the Tenebrous Grey, I then attempt some moody freehand words. So I had red tear on the larger parchments, and then some squiggly wiggly lines on the others. So next stage is the power sword. This is where we are going to move over to the airbrush, just because I find it a lot easier than having to do multiple glazes. I find the airbrush with power swords is so much easier. So the primary goal here is we're going to go for the glowing blue effect. So I'm going to use some intense white first. And with this, I do an edge highlight all the way around the sword, pick out the power nodes, pick out the central line of the sword, the very tips as well I pick out as white, and I use some watered down white to fill in the sort of the letters that are on the bottom of the sword. If you weren't using an airbrush, you would have to water down some white very heavily, and then do this as glazes. Lots and lots and lots of glazes, going from white up to the bright white, and then even glazing back in some black so you get the transitions done. But it is possible doing it with glazes. So now I'm moving over to the airbrush, and I'm using the Liquitex ink, white ink. I use about 2 bar maximum of pressure through the airbrush. It's just a cheap Fender airbrush, and all I'm doing now is I'm creating the transition that the sort of haloing effect that the airbrush naturally does from the bright white down into the sort of gradient down into the black. Now most of the sword is covered in white, but very, very subtly in some areas, just literally one tiny little squirt, and then so that you get those nice gradient transitions from the black into the white. To get the blue colour on it, we're using the contrast paint Frostheart blue from Warhammer. It's not even Frostheart blue, it's just called Frostheart, but it's blue. And again, straight through the airbrush, short sharp bursts, making sure to cover all of the white that we've just done. A step that's after this that's optional, but it kind of takes away the blackness that we've got there, is I use some contrast Talazar blue and just spray that into where the dark areas of the sword are, just so you get a transition from that bright blue down into the dark blue. That is totally optional, but it just adds a little bit of different colour variation onto the sword itself. Very, very subtle, but it makes that dark black into a dark blue. I then use AK Sky Blue, which is almost like a Warhammer Blue Horror, and I edge highlight the entire sword, the centre part of the sword as well, and the tips, and add some little lightning bolts from the power node as well. I then water down some white, very heavily watered down, and just fill in the letters in the white so that you create a nice bright white area, glazing a bit more and more into the center so that you get a sort of glowing pulsing feel from the center of the sword, or center of the letters. So yeah, this is just your opportunity just to add in some highlights now using that sky blue, which is almost, it's, you know, on the camera it's looking almost white, but it's not. It's got a blue hint to it, but only adding white at the very tips, so using white very, very sparingly as your brightest point, so that we get those natural gradients and that the white does look like it's that final bright highlight. If it's too much, then obviously it won't look like a highlight, it will just look like you've gone over some edges. So for the base on this guy, I didn't do anything really overly clever. I applied some super glue to the bottom and then used my rubble mix that I bought off of eBay. It's just brick rubble, dirt rubble. It was just, I bought about a kilogram of it for about £5 or whatever off of eBay, and I just dunk the base of it into that. I then do a heavy dry brush of AK Grim Brown, followed by a lighter dry brush of AK Mud Brown, and then even lighter brush of AK Mud Light Earth to get a nice grimy base coat feel. And then I remembered that I totally forgot to do the power nodes on the back of his shield. So this follows the same principle as the sword, but all I'm doing here is where the little power nodes are, I do a few squirts of white ink straight over the top. I then apply over that some of that Frostheart blue. Once all that is dry, I then use our white contrast mix that we've got. So in previous videos I've told you how to make this, but it's just 1 part water, 1 part white ink, 1 part contrast medium, and I make a big pot of it and keep it there. I've put a couple of magnets in there as well so that you can give it a good shake to mix the pigments up, but it's basically what you create is a white contrast that is pure white, and it runs really well and acts like a sort of wash contrast. So what I do is add a little bit to the brush and then put the brush in the middle of those power nodes so that it flows either side, and then a few multiple layers so that it gathers down, surrounds those power nodes more than the sort of connectors coming off of it. So it's a very quick and easy way of showing power effects like the sword that's just on the back of the shield. And if you're batching these up, if you had the bigger squads where it's got 5 of these guys in, it really doesn't take that long, and you can do this off the back of just normal thunder shields and that. Yeah, it's a good, quick and easy way of doing blue power glow. So there is the Armageddon Space Marine Captain for the Blood Angels, all ready to go. So obviously a majority done with brushwork. We just did the airbrush on the sword and the power nodes, but again with glazes and time you could do that with a brush. It just takes a lot of time, but with the airbrush it's very quick. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the painting tutorial. We'll be covering off all the other Space Marine characters in other tutorials with different factions as well, so it's not all just Blood Angels. I'll be doing different factions just to mix it up a little bit. As always, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTubey magic. It really helps me along, really helps the channel grow and allows me to do more videos. Any questions, just send us a message, and happy painting, my fellow painters.